Okay, today's field trip, we're at the Yant Flat Trail, which is on kind of the Red Cliffs area, but we're at the top of the mesa. So sort of where we were a couple weeks ago in Leeds at the Red Reef Trail. This is basically just up in elevation from there, up on top of this mesa. So it's an interesting area because it's a mix of, it's a real blend of more lower elevation Mojave type elements and more higher elevation kind of mountain elements. So for example, right here in front of us, we've got Berberis Fremontii, Fremont's mahoneya, which is in the Berberis, right, the ranunculales. And that's a very kind of hot desert, lower elevation kind of thing. And right behind it, we've got a single leaf pinyon pine, and we've got cliff rose here. So this is just a fun spot because it's kind of a real blend of different things. So I just mentioned this shrub and we haven't really officially met it yet, so I'll go ahead and start off talking about this one. So this is, again, Berberis Fremontii, Fremont's mahoneya. So these things used to be placed in their own genus, Mahoneya, but phylogenetic analysis has shown that they, basically if you recognize Mahoneya, then that is paraphyletic with respect to Berberis. But the distinction that used to be made traditionally is that Mahoneya has compound leaves and Berberis has simple leaves. And so here we've got a couple of these Mahoneyas or Oregon grape plants in our area, a couple of these species. This is the lower elevation one. You can see it looks kind of like Dixie Live Oak, except when you look closely at the leaves, you see that whole thing is a leaf there. So this is a compound, pinnately compound leaf, but those leaflets are similarly or even more spiny than a Dixie Live Oak, right? So really, really spiny leaves. And then the other one that you would see in our area is the creeping mahoneya or creeping Oregon grape. That's Berberis repens. That's at a little bit higher elevation, and it's a much lower, kind of just a low shrub, whereas this one gets pretty tall. Unfortunately, not flowering quite yet, but should be pretty soon in the next couple of weeks or so. And when they flower, so recall that in that family, Berberis, there are yellow flowers with multiple whorls of 3, so sepals and petals that kind of all look the same. And there's like 4 whorls of petaloid things in multiples of 3. So that is Fremont's mahoneya. And the mahoneya, the fruits are edible, so that's why they're sometimes called Oregon grape. They're pretty sour, kind of astringent, but they are edible. Talked about this at Red Cliffs, but there's a bunch of it here. So this is, just to revisit, this is Mexican cliff rose, Persea stansberryana. So last time I talked a lot about how to kind of recognize cliff rose from bitterbrush. They're both Perseas. Cliff rose is the leaves, remember they have this white crusty secretions on them, and usually 5 lobes, and the leaves are a little smaller than bitterbrush leaves. And just to revisit, so remember this is within Rosaceae, this is in the Dryadoideae subfamily. So there's a fruit from last year, again with these plumose, the carpels have these plumose styles that help the achene to disperse, right? So it's a dry indehiscent fruit, and the style persists and becomes really feathery or plumose. And they're usually longer than this. These are the ones that they're still on the plant because they're from last year and they aborted at some point, right? So they're kind of like halfway through their development. Usually if you see the ones that are mature and with a viable seed inside, the styles are even longer. Here's a few things we've also seen before. So we got a bunch of blackbrush here. So there's our blackbrush, right, with those woody fruits from last year is still persisting. We've got those shrubs with the dried inflorescences on them. That's broom snakeweed, right? So Gutierrezia cerothrae. There's some more of that. And here's another one that probably a lot of people know already, but I want to go over it. So big sagebrush, right? So big sagebrush is a, we met its cousin, sand sage, Artemisia filifolia, a few weeks ago when we were at Hellhole. So this is big sagebrush, Artemisia tridentata. The name tridentata is referring to the shape of the leaves. So we look at the leaves. So see how they kind of lack a petiole. So they're just these, where's my hand? There we go. Okay, so the tridentata is referring to those three lobes at the tip of the leaf. And just this elongate leaf that doesn't really have a petiole, just kind of tapers down to where it attaches to the stem. And if you crush them, again, something you won't get in the virtual experience, but you'll have plenty of chances to find this plant around Cedar City if you're here, or really almost anywhere in Utah. So it's got this really nice, pleasant odor, but again, sagebrush not related to true sage, like the desert sage that we saw, the door sage that we saw last week at Historic Babylon. So this is a composite. It doesn't really look like, when you look at the inflorescences, they're not obviously composite style inflorescences because the flowers, the florets are so tiny there. So Artemisia tridentata. What else do I want to say about this? Yeah, just really ecologically important species in the Great Basin and really all throughout the Intermountain West. So up in Cedar, we've got lots of Pinyon Juniper forest, and that's similar to what we've got here. So there's a juniper. The pinyon pine here, though, is different from the one that we have around Cedar City. So this is one needle pinyon or single leaf pinyon, I can't remember. It's Pinus monophylla. So around Cedar we have two needle pinyon, which is Pinus edulis or edulis. Thanks, bud. So the one here is very closely related but different in that, just like the name would suggest, right? Pinus monophylla, one needle pinyon. So the fascicles just have, right, just one needle in them for the most part. So that's not going to be like completely never changing. So you'll find some bundles that have two, but most of them just have one leaf. That's all. Just one thing, right? It's interesting when you look at two needle, the overall look of the needles is the same, but it's like this one needle was like just split in half in the two needle pinyon. Otherwise, they're really similar species. The cones are a bit different. In this one, they're shorter and fatter. I don't know if you can see that, the cones up there, because the light's not great. They're a little bit shorter and fatter than the cones of two needle pinyon. But otherwise, they're basically kind of ecologically interchangeable species, and generally you just have one or the other. They kind of replace each other. So Pinus monophylla is more abundant to our west in the Great Basin, and mostly what we have around here, like especially around Cedar, what you'll see is the two needle pinyon. So here in this little open, kind of cleared out area, we've got a bunch of these little herbs. And this is an interesting plant. We haven't seen the family before. This is in the Gentianaceae, so the gentian family. And it's actually the same family as elkweed or monument plant. If you know that plant that grows up at Cedar Breaks, makes these big rosettes with like large basal leaves. And then when it flowers, it creates like this it's monocarpic, kind of like an agave, so it basically stores up all of its nutrients for its whole life and then flowers once right before it dies. So this is a relative, it's in the same family. This is white margined Frasera. So Fraser Alba marginata. And it's basically just like a little version of the monument plant. And it's not quite in flower yet, unfortunately. So we can just see it's just getting ready to flower there. But what else do you notice about it, like the phyllotaxy? Do you notice anything interesting about the phyllotaxy? Let me get right down in there so you can see it. can you tell that it's actually got whorled phyllotaxy, right? So here's one leaf attaching here. Here's another one here at the same node. Here's another one here at the same node, and another one here over on the other side. So there's 4 leaves per node. So this very like interesting architecture. So this whorled phyllotaxy is pretty unusual, right? So we have most commonly things with alternate phyllotaxy, then a few things with opposite phyllotaxy, but this is pretty rare. So that whorled phyllotaxy, you see that in some things in this family. So that is white margined Fraser, and you can see where the white margin part comes from, right, on the leaves there. So Fraser Alba marginata. Okay. This shrub is another one that we haven't met before, although if you are from California and if you know the chaparral vegetation in California, then you probably know the group. So this is a ceanothus. So that's a really diverse group in the California kind of Mediterranean vegetation. Here we've basically got this one species. So this is Ceanothus greggii, which is Greg's ceanothus or Mojave ceanothus. And it's recognizable by, I mean, to me, it looks kind of like a less sort of condensed version of a blackbrush, right? We've got opposite phyllotaxy, and the leaves are a little bit larger than what you would see on a blackbrush, a little bit lighter green. Another thing that's kind of a good way to recognize it is you see how the bark is kind of light gray, and the nodes are black, so you get this kind of pattern of these opposite nodes, these like black dots on this light gray bark. Okay. It is getting ready to flower here, but it's not quite there yet. So those are the flower buds. But driving up the road to here, coming up past Leeds, I saw a few of them that were in full flower. So on the way back down, if there's time, I'm going to stop and take a video of it in flower and talk about the flower characteristics. So this is in the buckthorn family, Rhamnaceae, and Rhamnaceae is actually kind of closely related to the Rosaceae, to the rose family, and it's got some interesting floral characteristics. So if we have time, I'll stop and talk about them. Okay, here's the Utah juniper. So we've seen this one already. I talked about it at Red Cliffs, but there are a couple of interesting things I wanted to point out here. So first of all, I can't remember if I mentioned the male cones, right? The pollen cones of juniper. So there you can see them pretty well. They're pretty developed. And sometimes you can, when they're just at the right stage, if you tap, you can sometimes see pollen coming off. I'm not seeing any here. And then my kids just pointed out, where was it, you guys? Did you see the galls, or did you pull them off?
2. There's 2 more.
Okay, cool. So we've got galls here, right? So not to be confused with the seed cones, which look like that right there, right? Those kind of light blue purple things, berry looking things. So you've also got these galls, which are produced by a little midge, which is just a little type of a little tiny fly that, again, right? So galls basically are formed, generally they're formed by insects that cause the plant to develop abnormally from the plant's perspective. So it looks like a little cone, but it's a gall. So there's a little maggot growing and living inside there. If we peeled it open, we would probably be able to see it. And yeah, so it's a juniper midge. I can't remember the exact name of it, but the other thing I want to talk about that's really cool, so you also notice around here at the Yant Flat Trail, all the junipers, I don't know if you can see them. If you look at all these junipers, they're all pretty heavily under attack from parasites. So do you see how these kind of clumps here, you may have noticed this before, of clumps of yellow-green branches, right, within the juniper, and it actually looks kind of like a juniper branch, so it has opposite phyllotaxy and the leaves are very reduced and scale-like. But that is a totally separate species. That is a juniper mistletoe, and it's a parasite. And again, it's a hemiparasite, like when we talked about the, you gonna show me, Bud? You got one there in your hand to show us?
No,
Okay. Okay. So, So like desert paintbrush, right? Paintbrushes, it's a hemiparasite, so it does its own photosynthesis, but the roots tap into in the case of paintbrush, it taps into the roots of other plants. In the mistletoes, they tap directly into the branches of their host plant, right? So you can see they're just growing right out of the host plant. And so the seeds germinate on the branch of the host and then just tap right into there. So they have what's called hostorial roots. Hostorial just means basically like vampire, kind of they tap in and draw nutrients out, nutrients and water. And then there's actually one over here that I wanted to show. We've got some berries that are just mature on this one. So see that kind of salmon orange colored, this thing here. So let's take a look at this. You guys want to see this too?
What?
So the berry of the juniper mistletoe. So the thing that's cool about these is if you squish them, they're very kind of gummy and mucilaginous inside. Can you see that there? How sticky they are?
It looks like a pearl.
It does look like a pearl. So the way this works is basically these berries are attractive food for birds that hang out in the junipers, and the birds eat the fruit, they eat the berry, and then later after they process, it's so sticky that it actually passes through their digestive system with some of this kind of sticky mucilaginous glue still on it. So they pass the seed, and it's basically designed to just stick. So if it's a bird that hangs out in juniper branches, then it's likely that it's going to pass the seed while it's in a juniper, and that seed can then just stick right to the branch, and it is dispersed onto a new branch or a new host tree, right? The Latin name, I didn't mention it, is Phoradendron, Phoradendron, Phoradendron juniperinum. And mistletoes usually are fairly host specific. So there are mistletoes that attack junipers, there are mistletoes that attack other kinds of trees. So. Also, just to point out, right under this juniper, we've got our Fremont's Phacelia that we saw last week. So those little tiny herbs with these purple corollas. Just a really nice plant. There's a bunch of it around here. Right, and this there's a little bit of an open area here with some blackbrush and sagebrush here. And you also see these choyas kind of poking out amidst all of this. So this choya is different from the ones we've seen before. This is Whipples choya. Actually, I'm not sure if we've talked about choyas in this class already, because we were at Hellhole. I don't know if I talked about, there were some there. I don't know if I talked about them. Yeah, so maybe we haven't talked about choyas. So choyas are a type of cactus, right? They're in the genus Cylindropuntia. So basically within the cactus family, there's two main groupings, right? There's the cactoid group, which is things like our hedgehog cacti. So I have talked about this, I remember now. And then your Opuntioids, which is things like prickly pears and choyas. One of the key differences is that Opuntioids have those glochid spines, those little spines with the backward pointing barbs. They're tiny. They're just designed to get stuck in you. Pretty evil. So this is a choya, so Cylindropuntia, right? So prickly pears are Opuntia, choyas are Cylindropuntia. They're the, prickly pears have the flat pads, and so these are the ones with the cylindrical segments. So one of the ways we can recognize Opuntioids is they have these segments that grow kind of like jointed, so they branch. Cactoid cacti don't branch like this mostly, right? Saguaros and things like that do, but most of them don't really do that. And so this is our more high elevation choya. So you'll find this, you can find this up at Three Peaks. Not super common, but you'll find it around. It tends to grow a little bit lower to the ground and can even form mats, which the other choyas that we see like lower down in the Mojave, like buckhorn choya and silver choya, they don't do that. They grow kind of from a trunk. So this is Whipples choya, which is Cylindropuntia whipplei, so our more high elevation cholla.
Why did you say whoa?
All right, so I believe we've talked about the topic of cryptobiotic soil crusts, but in case not, just to revisit this topic. So cryptobiotic crusts are basically communities of microorganisms ranging to macroorganisms that live in the soil in the desert. They perform some really important ecosystem services. They stabilize the soil and prevent erosion. Some of the organisms that live in these communities fix nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, so they make basically ammonia available for plants to take up and use in amino acids to build proteins. And cryptobiotic crusts, they can range across multiple stages of development. And so here I'm seeing kind of a couple of stages of more mature cryptobiotic crusts. Oftentimes, you know, a soil might have some kind of cryptobiotic community going on in it, and you can't tell unless you kind of take some of this soil and break it apart. And if you can see like little filaments in it, right, those might be from algae or fungi that are living in that crust. But more developed crusts, you can tell they've kind of got this, they often have kind of this black surface on them. And right, so these basically things that live in here would be algae, cyanobacteria, other bacteria, fungi. And then the really mature development, you'll even get things like mosses associated with these crusts, right? So that's when you can tell it's kind of been left to develop for a long time. So basically the idea with crypto crusts, though, is that they're very fragile. So you have to be careful where you step when you're walking around off a trail, because if you step on it, basically they're slow developing, and once you break them up, that disturbance will basically destroy that community, and it has to start over from scratch. I don't know what kind of moss this is, but you know, if I had to statistically guess, I would say it was a Grimmia, but I don't know my mosses super well, although I'm trying to learn now. All right, so cryptobiotic crusts. So in this area, we've got an abundance of this little plant that's in the Ranunculaceae, the Buttercup family. So those little tiny yellow flowers that you're seeing there. I want to talk about this one. This plant is not a native. It is actually, so it's invasive. It's a Eurasian, whoops, there it goes. It is a Eurasian weed. The name is Buttercup, or the Latin name Ceratocephala testiculata. So Ceratocephala, cerato means horn, and cephala means head, and testiculata means like a testicle. So, and that's referring to the fruit. Basically the fruit is this super spiny little achene. So Ranunculaceae, so we've got sepals and petals on this one, usually 3 petals. And I don't know how well you guys can see it. I'm not seeing it super well myself here, but there are separate carpels. Let me see if I can get a good view of this here. So multiple separate carpels, lots of stamens. So it's got all these buttercup characteristics. The leaves are sort of like divided in sort of threes, right? So those triphid or ternate leaves. So you see this thing all over the place, and it's one of the things that's kind of in flower early on in the spring. It's pretty aggressive, so I don't know if you can tell, but this is all cryptobiotic crust, and this thing germinates pretty freely in this stuff. So it's a pretty recent arrival to Utah, and just seems to be kind of taking over these days. All right, Buttercup. We've been seeing tons of banana yucca baccata all through here as well. So again, just kind of fun, right? That's more of a, you know, lower elevation element, and here it is under a pine tree, which is just not the usual combination. So it's one of the reasons I really like this area. It's an interesting mix. All through here, we've got these yellow flowered plants, these little herbs, right? And let's take a closer look. So there's just tons of them here, right? If we get a little closer up, what do we see? So this is a review. We're gonna go ahead and quiz ourselves here. So we got 4 petals in a cross shape, or kind of X or H shape. And if we get in really close to a flower, we should be able to see 6 stamens in a 4 long, 2 short arrangement. Okay, leaves are simple with coarse teeth, and the plant grows in kind of a bolting pattern. So if you guessed crucifery or mustard family, Brassicaceae, you were right. And this is our western wallflower, Erysimum capitatum. All right, so here's our Dixie Live Oak, and we're sort of under the shade of a single leaf pine. And I just wanted to talk about this one because I don't know this species, but so see these little tiny sweet little herbs here, these little flowers. So this is some kind of a Phacelia, but I'm gonna have to figure out what species it is later when I get back. But I can recognize it's a Phacelia by one way is the flowers. So these violet colored corollas with 5 petals, and I don't know how well you can see, but they're fused. So that puts us in asterids. So that helps me narrow things down. And then the leaves themselves, if you can see the veins on the leaves. So the way the veins are kind of broadly, you've just got a few, it's pinnately veined, but the way those veins, they don't go right out to the margins of the leaves, but they sort of arc broadly up toward the tip. That's a very Phacelia characteristic. And then also we've got the inflorescence there that's kind of in this helicoid cyme or scorpioid cyme. I can't remember the difference between helicoid and scorpioid cymes off the top of my head, but basically that inflorescence that sort of curls around like a scorpion's tail, right? So this is some kind of Phacelia, and I'll look it up later and get the name when I upload the video. But fun to discover new stuff all the time, right? And then actually over here we've got, that's a Solanaceae fruit. So that's some kind of a ground cherry like Physalis. And you can see the seed in there, kind of the dried up remnants of the seed, the fruit in the middle. And then these are the calyx, so the sepals persist in these guys and form this papery sheath. And this is actually the plant that came from right there. I recognize the leaves as being a Physalis. So that's some kind of Physalis or ground cherry. So fun stuff. There's always like new things to discover. There's more of it there.
With its flowers?
So, yeah, with the fruits. So this prickly pear, I've been seeing a bunch of it here. I wasn't gonna mention it, but I noticed something here that's pretty cool and I think worth pointing out. So this is brown-spined prickly pear, Opuntia fiacantha. So this is a little larger than the one that we have in Cedar City. And they tend to grow kind of in a line along the ground. So the pads are all kind of laying down on the ground. You see that? So it's a little bigger and the areoles are spaced a little wider than the one we have in Cedar City, which is actually a subspecies of the old man prickly pear. But I wanted to mention this one or point this out because we've actually got fruit here. And I'm not going to mess with it too much because I think there's glochids on this fruit. Yeah, you can see the glochids on there. But this is mature fruit with seeds inside of it. And it looks like the seeds didn't completely develop. But let me see if I can get some out here. So that last one didn't turn out great. Got a couple of glochids for my troubles. But here's another one close by where the fruits have actually been munched on. You can see by some kind of critters, ground squirrels or jackrabbits or whatever. But you can see in some of them, I just wanted you to see the seeds down in there. So in the opuntioids, the seeds are covered with a bony, kind of a tough aril around them. So an aril is just an outgrowth from the base of the seed. I don't know if you can see it there, but so there's a bunch of these with fruits. What do you got there, bud? Okay, so this one is a special treat for me. I don't know if you guys will feel the same way about it, but because this plant comes from the group that I studied for my PhD, and I've never actually noticed this species up here before. So this is a fun discovery. This is a Claytonia, and it is Claytonia parviflora. Parviflora means small flowered. And claytonias are broadly known as miner's lettuces. The leaves are edible. And so you can see the leaves here are these, this is what we call a linear leaf, just like a long, narrow leaf that doesn't really have kind of much of a blade to it. It's really long and really thin. That would be a linear leaf. And then the flowers come in these, basically in claytonias, the flowers are subtended by two bracts on the flower stem. And let's see if I can get it better in focus here. Sorry. So the flowers are in bud. They're not really open on any of these yet. Looks like none of them are open, but they're just small. So this is Caryophyllales. They're small, 5-petaled flowers, white petals usually, sometimes with pink stripes on them. And what else? So in this case, the bracts below the flowers are fused. So in some of these species, the bracts are fused and they make this kind of what we call a peltate kind of cup around, right? So peltate just means that there's one stalk coming up in the middle. There's another species called Claytonia perfoliata that has that same thing. So this is Claytonia parviflora, and I'm very excited to see it here. And we're just growing in the shade of a juniper. So, you know, this is a cool spot. I just really like it. The Pine Valley Mountains here in the backdrop, and it is worth the visit. Here's another review one. So this is our Utah Yucca, right? So we've seen banana Yucca all throughout here, but there's a little patch of Utah Yucca here. So these ones sometimes have a bit of a trunk. You can't see it super well because it's obscured by the dead leaves. But they're really, one of the really diagnostic characteristics for Utah Yucca to differentiate it from the others in our area is that branching inflorescence, right? So you can see last year's inflorescence, how it's a panicle, right? So Utah Yucca. We just came up over this little rise here, and we came into this patch of Manzanita. So I want to talk about that one. Manzanita is in another family we haven't met yet. That's the Ericaceae, or the heath heather family. So this is a plant that we will find at higher elevations, both in the Great Basin but also in the Mojave. So this is point leaf Manzanita, which is Picea pungens. Yes, Picea pungens. And then around Cedar City, if you go up a little higher, you'll find green leaf Manzanita, which is very similar. It's a shrub with these kind of red-orange, beautiful branches, but the leaves are a little more oval and not as narrow, okay, in green leaf. So in the Ericaceae, in this family, the flowers in many of them are, so there's 5 petals here, but they're fused, okay? So this is an asterid, and you've got these kind of urn-shaped or bell-shaped flowers. That's very common in the Ericaceae. So we call that an urceolate flower, if you want a fancy Latin word for it. And this is just a gorgeous plant. I just love it. So, and unlike other asterids, Ericaceae have 5 carpels. Most asterids have 2 carpels. So that is Manzanita, which is Spanish for little apple, because the fruit is actually a little berry that I don't think is edible to humans. But so Arctostaphylos is the genus, and this is another one that's really diverse in the chaparral vegetation. So like in California, you'll find lots and lots of species. Around here, it's a little bit more manageable. There's just the 2 species, point leaf and green leaf Manzanita, and they're pretty geographically divided up. So if you've never been to Yant Flat before, this is the last little bit. So we've been walking through this sandy area, and it opens out onto this slick rock. So this is the big payoff at the end of the trail. It's only about a mile-long trail, really worth a visit if you've never been here before. Okay, so here we are out at the edge. So this is sometimes called Candy Cliffs, Yant Flat, and here's our big payoff viewpoint here. Yeah, do you see why the kind of candy striping on it? So
need to go
two.
pee. Lizard.
So I was just saying that I was going to do one more plant, and then I just saw another one, so I'm going to do two more plants. That's always how it is, right? So underneath this, so we've got our Dixie Live Oak here, right? Kind of sitting in the shade of this plant. We've got this little herbaceous perennial. So this is a Cryptantha, and this is yellow flowered Cryptantha, or yellow Cryptantha, Cryptantha flava. This is in the Boraginaceae, like our phacelias, right? So Boraginaceae, so there's 5 petals fused into a fused corolla, right? And then that's it's getting kind of washed out, it looks like. So you can see, we talked about with Boraginaceae, like at the top of the corolla tube, there's often, let me see, the light is just like really bright here, I guess. At the top of the corolla tube, there's kind of this little mouth there. Sometimes it's a different color, and this one it's not, but you can still see how there's kind of like these little swellings right at the top of the corolla tube. That's a pretty Boraginaceae characteristic. And then the inflorescence is that scorpioid cyme. Actually, I think it's a helicoid cyme. I'm just going to have to check that later. It's a cyme that curls to one side, right? And then the other thing with the Boraginaceae is that frequently the plant, in a lot of these, the plant is covered in these little simple needle-like hairs. Can you see those there? Like all over the leaves and so there's the leaves and the stem and the calyx, and everything's got these little needle-like hairs all over it. So Cryptantha flava, yellow Cryptantha, or I think they're called cat's eyes sometimes. And now the last one for real, maybe, probably. I'm not promising anything. So this is a relative of Yucca. So this is in the Asparagaceae. This is Utah Agave, Agave utahensis. And so agaves really like these, you can see we're kind of in a slick rock environment with really shallow soil. That's where you're going to tend to find agaves. And they get about to this elevation and not really any higher. And so here's the plant itself, and you can see there's this cluster of rosettes. So it has a really interesting life history strategy, kind of like the elkweed that I mentioned before. Basically what they do is an individual plant, right, one rosette grows over a span of many, many years, and it basically is accumulating resources in its rootstock. And then at the end of its life, it will flower and it'll put out a big, gigantic reproductive output. So the advantage to doing it this way is that your inflorescence, your reproductive output relative to the size of the plant can be really great. So over here, you don't find too many of them here because it's a pretty heavily visited site. And I think people take them whenever they find them and take them home as souvenirs. But here's one kind of here in the middle of these manzanitas. So you can see down here, can you guys see that? So there's actually 2 rosette. The one that inflorescence is coming from is dead. That's the one in the back there. And then there's another one that's still alive. So there's that inflorescence. So relative to the size of that rosette, which is only maybe a foot across, you've got this massive reproductive output of this big flowering spike, or I guess technically be a raceme because the flowers are on petioles, right? So this gigantic raceme that's probably up to like 8 or 9 feet tall. So massive flowering output, which is going to be visible to pollinators from a great distance. Right, so this is a monocarpic strategy, which is basically what we call it when a plant flowers at the end of its life. So it lives for many years and then flowers once, as opposed to like what the Manzanita is doing, flowering every year like this, or basically every year that conditions are good enough. We call that an itero-paris strategy. So itero, like iterating, like just repeating over and over again. This is a monocarpic or semal-paris strategy. And then the other thing that they do, the other way that they reproduce, is they reproduce asexually by cloning themselves. So that's why over there, the cluster that we were first looking at, there were a bunch of rosettes all together. So those are basically clones of each other. So basically a plant will make pups kind of off to the side that will then also start to grow. So there's no genetic recombination going on there. They're just clones. But that's another way that they hedge their bet. So they kind of do both. They do an asexual cloning strategy, and then at the end of their lives, a big sexual reproductive flowering, you know, kind of making new seeds, more genetic recombination. So they do both. Okay, that's Utah agave, Agave utah-ensis. So this is kind of fun. Here is our Utah agave. Here's one that's just starting to flower. So I wanted to point that out. And agaves and yuccas are in the asparagus family. When the flowering shoots are just starting to emerge, you can really see that affinity with an asparagus. It just looks like a giant asparagus stalk with these bracts all over it. So that's kind of fun. I don't see any other ones that are going to flower this year. Okay, here's another one. So this is a Karpis, mountain mahogany. We've talked about this in class, but we haven't seen them yet. So this is in the Dryadoideae, right? Our subfamily of the Rosaceae. And this is the one with the smallest leaves in our area. So we have 3 Karpis species. This is cut-leaved mountain mahogany, which is Karpis intricatus. So see how small those leaves are. And then the flowers we got these spiny tipped branches, and the flowers are they're actually apetalous, and in this species we have a single carpel. So one carpel, you can see the style sticking out of that one right there. And there's the stamens on there, so no petals. So that's Karpis intricatus, cut-leaved mountain mahogany, Dryadoideae subfamily of the Rosaceae.